Hi and welcome to this flash lecture on the history of atheism. Now, the history of atheism, as indeed the history of most modes and movements of thought, begins in the European sense with Greece, and there was a kind of debate in and around Greek philosophy about whether atheism was the position to take. There was certainly skepticism towards the myths, towards religion, towards the gods. There's certain ambiguity around concepts. Aristotle says there is a prime mover, an uncaused cause which starts the universe set into motion. Whether we can say that is God in the way that we might understand the word God, is the prime mover a God? That's open to question. Certainly later on, Christian thought tried to assimilate Aristotle. He was incredibly important to the medieval scholastics. But whether Aristotle himself was a theist in the way that we would understand the word, it's open to question. However, what is indisputable is that there were Greek and Roman materialists who very much were atheists. They had a picture of the universe which didn't need a god. It didn't need the spiritual at all. It didn't need souls. For example, someone like, Democritus, who's very well known for predicting atoms. He felt that the universe was made up of these tiny, tiny particles, so centuries, millennia in fact, in advance of the discovery of the atom. Democritus in ancient Greece predicted that this was the way that the universe was composed. This is Aristotle writing about Democritus. Democritus thinks that the nature of eternal things consists in small substances, infinite in quantity, and for them he posits a place distinct from them and infinite in extent. He calls place by the names void, nothing, and infinite, and each of the substances he calls thing, solid, and being. He thinks that the substances are so small that they escape our senses, and that they possess all sorts of forms and all sorts of shapes and differences in magnitude. And what we have here is a theory of the entire universe that requires just a void and these little particles rushing around. There's no need for God. We also get the same kind of thing in the Roman thinker Lucretius, who wrote a very famous poem, philosophical poem called On the Nature of Things. Now, this kind of tradition running through Democritus, Lucretius, and others, it's a kind of secret history of atheism. It runs right through to the Renaissance and beyond, and thinkers can kind of pick up these ideas of materialism, of atoms, of a universe that just doesn't need a god. However, of course, Christianity and Christian thought holds an overarching sway over the European period from 300, 400 AD right through to the Reformation. We do see thinkers who are tarred with atheism, people like Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, or Baron d'Holbach, from a century later, the French materialist thinker, and to various extents they might be considered materialist atheists. However, arguably, the history of atheism in the modern sense begins in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. Now, it's a misconception that the Enlightenment was an atheist movement. Yes, it was critical of received dogmas. Yes, it was critical of the supernatural. Yes, it was critical of the church. Certainly people like Voltaire, Rousseau, they were very critical of Christianity. However, one can be anti-Christian to varying degrees without being atheist. And to understand what was happening in the 18th century, we have to bring in a new term, which is deism. And really, if we're looking at the religious character of the rationalism of the 18th century, then where we'd want to locate it is not in atheism, not in what we'd recognise as atheism, but in something called deism. And deism is a kind of religious belief that sees God as very, very distant. He's an intelligent craftsman. He's like a watchmaker. He creates a wonderfully intricate universe and he sets it into motion, and then he steps back. There's no need for the kind of messy interactions between God and people that one finds in the mythology of Christianity. And to varying stripes, many rationalist and Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century are better described as deists rather than atheists. They do believe in a God, but it's a very different kind of God to the God we find in the Bible. So deism is one important place to see the beginnings of atheism, because what happened was that deism kind of progressed. It progressed through the Romantic period and beyond into more and more anti-Christian forms, and forms that seem further and further away from theism. Another central event from the 18th century comes with David Hume, the Scottish philosopher actually, the British philosopher, the British thinker, the arch-skeptic, the arch-empiricist of the 18th century philosophical scene. And Hume, among his many philosophical arguments, in this context, the most important one is his argument against miracles. And he makes a quite neat little logical deduction, which is that if someone tells us that the laws of nature have been violated, we don't have to believe him. We shouldn't believe him, because even though we might trust him, we only trust him because we have experience of him being a trustworthy person. But we have much more solid experience of the laws of nature being the same day after day after day. So Hume asks us, what is it more likely to have happened? That this man who we seem to think has been reliable, who has given us credit, he seems to be reliable, is it more likely that he is lying for some reason, or is it more likely that the laws of nature have been violated? And working probabilistically, Hume argues, even if we have experience of this man being reliable, we can't accept his account of a miracle, because a miracle is the violation of nature and the laws of nature. And the thing is, the laws of nature, through our own experience, have proved themselves far more reliable, far more consistent, day after day, year after year, than any human being has. It's more likely that the person is lying than nature has been violated. And this was a huge body blow for Christian theology, Christian apologetics in the 18th century, because Hume seemed to be ripping apart one of their key arguments, which was that there have been miracles, miracles must come from God, ergo God exists. So, deism on the one hand, Hume on miracles on the other. The 18th century is really beginning to trouble the Christian worldview and the religious worldview. That's not to say they were all atheists. For example, Hume, he took a very pragmatic view on God. He seemed to think, yes, we're just going to believe. Whether Hume was or was not a Christian, was or was not a theist, again, that's an open question. But things like Hume's argument, things like deism, this was beginning to trouble Christianity. And this movement continued on into the 19th century. And one country where it happened perhaps more than any other was Germany. And ironically, the beginnings of this German movement towards atheism does not begin in any kind of materialist philosophy, but it begins with theology. At the end of the 18th century, German theologians became biblical critics. They begin to look at the biblical text in a very particular way, a way we would actually recognise as a kind of literary criticism. And what's interesting is they look at the document and they begin to say, this is just a text, this is just a book. We can study it, we can make assumptions about it, interpretations of it, just like any other book. And they begin to untie the narrative and the text of the Bible. So whereas previously the Bible was more or less considered a unified, authoritative document, the German critics, people like Eichhorn, they began to pull that consensus apart. They would look at Genesis and they would say, the creation story, there seems to be two creation stories. Maybe there were two authors, two human authors, who put down certain stories, and another person, a compiler, put those two stories together. And what we end up with is a much more human text, a patchwork text. And just like the deists, of course, these higher critics, it's called the German higher criticism, this German theological movement, this German critical movement, it wasn't anti-Christian, it was Christian. But it begins a kind of movement, a process, a momentum which moves beyond Christianity and ends up in an atheist place. We see this in a series of German thinkers. Feuerbach is a watershed for this. He writes a book called The Essence of Christianity, and he makes a very important move, and it's indebted to the higher critics and a kind of demythologizing intellectual project that begins with the higher criticism, but has now passed over from Christian theology into outright atheism. Feuerbach says that God is a projection of man. Man was not created by God, gods are created by men. And this reversal proves absolutely crucial. We find it in lots of places. We find it in Marx, for example, who says that religion is a sigh of the oppressed. It's their conditions, in their intolerable conditions, their suffering, which produces a piety, which produces a religious instinct. The image of God is created by certain elements of the human condition. So again, that very important reversal. Man was not created by God, God was created by man. We also find it, for example, in Freud, the Austrian psychoanalyst. And crowning this German tradition at the end of the 19th century is this man here, Friedrich Nietzsche, who declares very famously that God is dead. And he's probably the most important atheist thinker, the most important atheist philosopher, because he begins to take atheism really seriously. He founds his entire metaphysics on the assumption of atheism, which previously was very radical, but in the 20th century philosophical scene would become more and more conventional. So, in this book, The Gay Science, we find Nietzsche declaring that God is no longer culturally believable. The greatest recent event, he calls it, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, is already starting to cast its first shadow over Europe. And so Nietzsche says God is dead, God must be removed from our morality, from our philosophy, and from our everyday life. And he says we must live up to this killing of God, this moment when God is no longer at the centre of things. Now that's the philosophical lineage, the very intellectual lineage. There's also one other important thing to think about in the 19th century, and that is science. Now, even in the 18th century, people from their geological discoveries were realising that the Earth was a lot older than the Bible, or at least the traditional interpretations of the Bible account, were saying it was. I think Bishop Ussher suggested it was created in about 4004 BC. Looking at the rocks, looking at the strata, looking at the geology, already people were thinking that timescale just doesn't work. And so there was a massive debate that raged around geology and theology, and geology became a site for the very fate of Christianity and whether it was believable, whether the stories or the narratives or the explanations it gave of the world were believable. And this reaches ahead with not a geologist, but a biologist. And that biologist is, of course, Charles Darwin. And his theory of evolution really hits the creation story, the creation mythos, right at its heart. And he says, man, humanity, the human race is an animal. Remember what happens in the creation story in Genesis. God places the human beings in charge of earth. They are the stewards of creation. They look after the creation. The creation is for them. Christianity in that sense is fundamentally anthrocentric. It's centered on humans. We are at the heart of the world. What evolution does is say, no, we are just another species of animal. We have common descent. We have been descended from other animals. And so we are decentered. We are moved from the centre of things, from this privileged position that Christianity, in common with many modes of thought, had put us there. So anthropocentrism and the creation account given by Christianity and the Bible, that's really knocked sideways by evolution, by Darwinism. And these kind of multitude of shocks meant that certainly by the end of the Victorian period, by the end of the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, atheism was becoming more and more a kind of default position for intellectual culture. Previously, if you were anti-Christian, you would have to do the justifying. I think after Feuerbach, after Nietzsche, after Darwin, it was the Christians who would have to do the justifying. It was the theists who would have to do the justifying. And in the 20th century, in the kind of philosophy we see, be it the existentialism of Sartre or whatever, the decentering of human beings from the centre of things, and the idea that God is dead and we can't appeal to the notion, the concept of a God to guarantee certain things such as ethics or a metaphysics or an account of creation. We can't do that anymore. That's commonplace now. And that movement began all the way back, arguably in Greece, but certainly in the 18th century with deism and human miracles. on through the 19th century in German thought and through scientific developments, geology, evolution, and into the 20th century, we reach an atheist century. However, there's three things to remember, I suppose. One, this history of atheism is not being progressive. Now, there is a hypothesis called the secularization hypothesis, very important to remember. The idea is that as society or culture becomes more and more philosophically and scientifically advanced, it will move from religious belief to religious disbelief, and there's a kind of a goal, which is the secular society, and we've been steadily moving towards that. And I suppose what I've just been saying kind of seems like I'm agreeing with the secularization hypothesis. Well, yes, we have been becoming more secular, but it's important to remember that a lot of these thinkers weren't atheists. What they were doing was often trying to seek a purer religion, sometimes a purer Christianity. Those higher critics, those German theologians, those German readers of the Bible at the end of the 18th century, they didn't want to demolish Christianity. They didn't want to rip apart the foundations of Christian belief. They wanted to purify and strengthen them by having a more accurate and valid and defensible picture of what the Bible actually was as a text rooted in a certain history, rooted in a certain human experience. And it's the same across the board. Deists were quite happy to have a concept of God, but they were kind of attacking the Christian God, or a certain concept of the Christian God, and reserving a space for a deist God, a very different kind of deity. Their arguments arguably moved beyond that, but what they were doing at the time was certainly not atheist. So remember that this history is not progressive, and a lot of these important thinkers and important interventions were certainly not intended to be anti-Christian or anti-theist. Sometimes they were very much aimed at founding a purer religion or a purer Christianity. Secondly, one other snag with the secularization hypothesis is it's very centered in a certain Northern European experience. Even now, there are far more religious believers on this planet than there are atheists. Islam has risen to a massive position of geopolitical importance. One only has to look at the American political scene to see the continued relevance of religion, a very particular kind of religion, to cultural and political and social and ethical life in the United States, the superpower. So we can't certainly say that we live in a secular age when we have these very important religious factors in our world. Certainly in the global south, in the developing world, religion has been expanding, if anything. And we must also bear in mind that the 20th century, despite being perhaps an atheist century, has produced some amazing theologians, some amazing theological thinkers, people like Karl Barth, Bonhoeffer, Jürgen Moltmann. Look them up on Wikipedia. They are some of the most inventive and profound theologians of Christian history, and they are theologians of the 20th century, responding to 20th century thought. And finally, we come to the new atheism, this kind of atheism attached to people like Dawkins. And this is worth examining because is it itself religious? This is what people are saying. Are they becoming absolutists in themselves, dogmatic in their claims? People like Dawkins, people like Hitchens. What is this new atheism? What is its relationship to the history of atheism that I've just sketched? One interesting, important thing is people like Dawkins and the late Hitchens, they've put atheism right there, secularization, religion, right at the heart of everyday life, of contemporary debates that you read about in the newspapers, and that's great. But to understand them, I think you have to understand where atheism comes from, and I think that's what I've tried to do in this lecture, so I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.